Day where we've had a nor'easter making its way across the East Coast. My sister runs a farm as well as is a pharmacist, so you know that she's overwhelmed right now with COVID vaccines, etc. She works in a hospital, but 8 inches of snow is what she said there in New Hampshire. I'm Emily Ott, and I'm the Executive Director of Healthy Congregations. And it's good to have all of you with us today. Today we're going to have a conversation with our guest. And Todd needs to leave by the hour. But I hope to ask you, the rest of you, to stay on a little bit longer after Todd goes to his other things for his day, because I have several things about ideas that I'd like to share with you about some upcoming prospects and projects for Healthy Congregations. So likely you know Tod Bolsinger in some way or another, following the publication of his book, Canoeing the Mountains. And he's an experienced, long-serving parish pastor who now works with others who are preparing for ministry or preparing to deepen their resilience in ministry leadership. So my understanding, and having conversation actually with Pete Steinke after our Navigating the Rapids conference, that Todd, you first were connected with Healthy Congregations when you were in the parish, and that also Pete seemed to remember you brought a whole group of people from your parish to have some systems training at that time. And most of you know that Todd was with us in May along with Pete. He's a connected ministry colleague. He's a friend and a mentor to many, a spouse and a father, and a generous conversation partner, as is evidenced by his willingness to spend an Advent Thursday hour with all of us. So welcome, Todd.
Nice to be with you all, Emily. Really, it's really very nice to be with you.
These are really good thinkers too, Todd. So I look forward to, I've got a few things that I am thinking about and want to share and have some conversation with Todd, but I do want to open up, and I will open it up for any comments and questions you might have, the gathered group, to be in conversation with Todd. So I don't know, how many of you have already invested in tempered resilience?
You're my favorite people. I knew I
I was lucky enough to get a free copy from InterVarsity. So, Tempered Resilience was released in November, and I'm really aware, Todd, of how much of your thinking was shared with us about the book in May as we were in the Navigating the Rapids conference. But I'm wondering, though, if you would share with us, what were the prompts that led from canoeing to tempered resilience? If you would share some of the thinking here, or even some external things that happened.
Indeed. And it is very nice to be with you guys. I love being able to have conversations, even more than making presentations, because I learn a lot from them too. So thank you for being willing to engage this conversation with me. So basically, tempered resilience came out of a set of conversations that I was when Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, I began to get invited to speak in some places about that. And what I would find is I would get into the conversation, I'd finish my presentation, whoever invited me, kind of like Emlyn, or it would be a bishop or a district superintendent or somebody, would be very gracious and usually invite me to lunch or dinner or something before I got on a plane to fly home. And then oftentimes I would have them say to me, "That was really helpful. Thank you so much. I don't think we have anybody who can do that." And I would be like, oh, I guess I got to do a better job of training or explaining it or something. And then quickly the conversation shifted from, no, it's not about the techniques and stuff. Thank you for that. It's really, I'm not sure we have anybody who has the stomach for that. And for those of you who know, who've been around work, that's at the core of it, right? Like, what do you do with your own anxiety? Other people are so anxious that they're sabotaging or stopping the very change, right? And so what I began to listen for when I was coaching pastors or working with other folks was that line more and more. And then it just dawned on me that every place I went, no matter what part of Canoeing the Mountains or adaptive change they wanted me to talk about, everybody wanted me to talk about sabotage. Like, that's the one that everybody wanted to talk about. And then quickly that became a conversation about, well, not only how do we survive it, like what do we do, how do we navigate through it, but what do we do with what sabotage does to us? And so that became really the conversation that I was having more and more often. I had a pastor say to me, I'm pretty sure I can learn to lead change the way you're talking about it. I'm not sure I can survive it. So that led me to a bunch of research and work on the notion of resilience and the kind of resilience needed to face internal resistance. That's at the heart of the book. It's acknowledging that for most leaders, the most difficult thing is not the challenge outside that we are facing. It is internal resistance of our people when we call them to face the challenge outside.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight, Todd. And I would say it's even a resistance within clergy leaders too. And wonder what you think about that relative. What I see a lot is clergy leaders wanting to focus outside also, not just the folks in the ministry setting, but the leaders themselves. So what are your thoughts? Have you seen that too, or?
Yeah. Well, so the first way that I began to think about this was when Ed Friedman talked about a failure of nerve, right? The whole notion that what is it about your own anxiety that makes you then end up colluding with non-change, like the very thing you were asked to lead or to do, you then end up colluding with people. And I see this happen a lot. Matter of fact, I ended up working with a consulting group because I said to the person who we had brought in as a consultant, I said, look, I'm trying to refer you to people, and there's enough people who've used your work that what they're basically saying is you pay them a lot of money, they're very impressive in the room, but no change really happens. Mm-hmm. And that, I want you to think about that. And the principal said to me frustratedly, he said, well, our biggest problem is the very pastor who hires us then ends up not wanting to change. And the board then colludes with the pastor. Oh, you're doing a fine job. I think we could put this on the site for a while. And pretty soon it becomes this collusion cycle so I began to recognize that as the failure of nerve that pastors often have. And then in the book, I identify a second one, which I call the failure of heart. That's my own language, because that's really the part when pastors or clergy particularly deal internally with the seething bitterness or cynicism that comes after a long time of trying to bring change. We become cynical, disconnected. It's Moses in Numbers 11 saying, if you're going to leave me with these people, kill me now, put me to death. And our version of that is, God, I can always sell real estate. I could just, just let me anything else but this. That's where I go to. I would love to go work for the National Park Service and just do trail maintenance. Then I wouldn't have to talk to a person. I would just and I could. Right? So that is what I began to recognize internally. The struggle for the pastors were, and particularly pastors, but other leaders, were the failure of nerve and failure of heart that they were experiencing, and that tempered resilience was my way of trying to identify how to be formed for that challenge.
It's interesting. Michael Jupin, who's with us, put in the chat that Friedman's quote, which is in your book too, Tempered Resilience, about dealing with sabotage is key to the kingdom as well. Yeah. I think that it's interesting, and I'm very interested over a long period of time about the relationship between family systems or systems thinking and adaptive leadership too. And you do a lot of the correlation there, and even your reference to heart is really an adaptive leadership component, the Sacred Heart that Heifetz and Linsky talk about. But I wonder what prompted the coming together of those two pieces in your own thinking.
Yeah, it's this is a really interesting place for me. I think it's because what I began to realize is when I began to try to lean into adaptive change. So I first became aware of systems thinking first, like through Pete's work. And I said, you're right. I brought my entire staff to a Healthy Congregations gathering that Pete led, and it was really helpful. I was a younger pastor, and often by my own personality and age and stuff, I created reactions in people, and so I needed to figure out what to do with that. And then I had a whole staff that I think conscious, you tend to create a staff that is like you because you want to feel comfortable, all that kind of stuff. So the system stuff became really helpful for me. And I put it aside when I started reading about adaptive change. And then all of a sudden I found myself going back to my notes because stuff like reactivity and sabotage and the whole notion of, I mean, Richard Blackburn's notions of manage yourself, stay calm, stay the course. I just had all the best answers to adaptive work for most clergy are more easily accessible when they think about systems work. Like, I think it just becomes, it's easier work to get to. So what I found, many people had read Heifetz, but they didn't know what to do with them, with Heifetz and Linsky. They didn't really know what to do with them. What they did very often is mislabeled adaptive things as adaptive means hard, technical means easy, and like they would mislabel it. But systems work, people, especially if they're all reflective, and I'm in the main line, and in the main line, we all do C and stuff like that. So the mainline combination was more accessible. So that's where it started for me, and it just has felt like the right set of tools that can work together all the way through.
Think about, and I've noticed too, that real, what I can say, a natural understanding of the experience of sabotage. When you're ministry leaders immediately get that. And certainly that's something that Friedman raised in a description about certain kinds of relationships. But I've also noticed that describing or labeling things as sabotage can also be a rabbit hole. And meaning that people begin to think me good, them bad kind of thing. So, the whole idea that you're talking about the ability to observe the dynamics and stay connected in your book. And also it's true in many of Pete's writings too, staying connected and also staying within the principles that you're trying to operate, and also whatever the new thinking is to maintain that. So what are your thoughts about that, the problem of labeling something sabotage?
Yeah, well, as you nailed, two big problems. The one problem is people who resist the notion of sabotage. I had to spend a lot of my time saying to people that when we label something as sabotage, and I actually, I have two hunches about this. I could totally be wrong, and you guys might be able to correct me on this. I think there's something very interesting about the fact that Ed Friedman worked with so many in clergy, but was Jewish. There's time to use language that he knew would be evocative, right? And I think he did it to tweak us at times. I heard a couple of his lectures. I'm thinking, you're doing that you're just doing that to make people mad. Like, you're just trying to get them out of their playing nice thing. So when he called people a hunger, when he talks about the keys to the kingdom as being savage, he's using very clearly some Christian language, but he's tweaking it. And I think that part of that work is actually what's happening in sabotage. To label something as sabotage is to take, I think for clergy, it is to take seriously what they experience it to be. That's why they get so mad and angry and hurt and betrayed. But they will never say it out loud, because that sounds like you're saying somebody's evil. And these are, of course, my brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I often say to people, sabotage is not the bad things evil people do. It is the human things anxious people do.
Absolutely. And so just so you know, we'll be able to have some conversation about this, but you've got several people in this group who actually studied with Ed Friedman.
Oh,
so,
good.
Yeah, so they can either verify your thoughts or give you some counter ideas to who are actually in groups with
Oh, please.
as well.
The other connection, by the way, between Heifetz and Friedman is found in Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' work, who obviously just passed away a couple of weeks ago. His commentary on the Torah, Lessons in Leadership, is very interesting for me. And so the notion that Edwin Friedman, who was a Jewish rabbi, here's Heifetz, who at least was Jewish, culturally Jewish, at least. I don't know how religious. And here was Jonathan Sachs writing this beautiful commentary that I actually make all my students use, and everybody I coach, I encourage, this is their devotional for the time we're together, because it reminds us that the Jewish tradition is so rooted in people and community and family that it just anchors us in ways the individualism of Christianity sometimes is not taken seriously. So I have found those to be just really important pieces. But for those of you who are closer to it, I'd love to hear your point.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Let's I hate this expression, but I'm going to say it, put a pin in it. Remember that. But I do think that you're pointing out something really important about the basis, even with Heifetz, It's Ruth, it's called Lessons in Leadership, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Sachs. Yeah.
SEKS, Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi of London, who just recently passed away, like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago.
But Heifetz, I was able to spend some time with him for a couple of J terms, and I think the more work he has done in consultation, the more he's aware of the principles of his Jewish faith. But he's a musician too. He's a really accomplished musician, and so there's some of that piece that you see in a lot of his work.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for you to move from a book on water to fire to
exactly.
elemental things, right? So I wonder what your next book is what elements.
You're gonna love this, because I just put a proposal into the publisher. It's about soil. It's about ground. Actually, that's the next one. It's really the working title, Good Soil, Holy Ground, and it's really about organizational culture as the culture for shaping health and fruit and vitality. So yeah, it's interesting that you said that, and when I started laughing, because water to fire the ground thing that is happening, soil thing happening.
Well, I actually teach a class in elemental spirituality. So yeah. So I think the next thing is stones or rocks for you then. So I'm just saying that you can have a series of 4 books there, Tod. So I've I asked you a bit in a pre-conversation via email if you would share some of the thoughts you had about how your own family work, Tod, contributed towards either the resources that you have or what prompted you to engage first in the systems work, and what it's been like for you and how you stay connected to that part of this kind of leadership.
Yeah, so that's very evident for me. So I'm married to a marriage and family therapist. We met as teenagers. The first 2, we were each other's first friend who came from a broken home. And so both of our families were broken homes. She ended up becoming a marriage and family therapist. I was reading stuff like Family Crucible and when I was 19. And so the systems work and family systems work helped me make sense of what I would say was my good parents creating a bad family. Like that's the way I can think of it. My parents are really good people. They were young when they had me. My mother was 19, my dad was 20. They were teachers. They were idealistic. They had the right values. Those kind of things. And our family became profoundly painful, and eventually my parents divorced. So I needed some way to think about that, and part of what family systems did for me was help me think about the way in which a system and emotion is more powerful than the parts in it, and that became a really important part, even of my own development, even of my own understanding of my early Christian faith. I was raised Roman Catholic. My grandfather's name is Guido Evangelisti. That is the truth about my and so those early issues, and I was in therapy because I was trying to figure out how to date this woman who I loved, and yet I said I dated her for 3 years and she dated me for 2 of those 3 years. And so that was as an early young age, and we got married relatively young, 24, 23, and we just had a lot of work. So that part of our own personal life and our own personal development, surrounded by a set of friends, almost all of whom were either pastors or therapists, and all of us thinking about these things, really became the place for shaping my own life, my pastoral identity, and my own identity. So to return to it later in my leadership work, like literally returning to it 15 or almost 20 years later, was in one sense going back and really sources that I trusted. Like they trusted because they'd helped my own life. And then to think about how that worked in the life of the church. I mean, you'll appreciate this, but I used to say, as a young man, I was actually pretty adept at working with older, strong women because my mother was one. And in many systems, older women, even in more patriarchal systems, are really some of the most vibrant spiritually vital and sometimes, in my case, problematic people. And so it became a way of having to really wrestle with some of those generational pieces, um, in ways that are both really were helpful for me, but
Mhm.
also made me aware of some of my blind spots and stuff that I need to pay attention to. This just gave me a lens and a language to do so that was just more helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How do you continue to, one of the things we do in health creations too is to stay, encourage people to stay in a coaching relationship with someone who helps one see the triangles and so on, because we continue to encounter them throughout our ministry life, no matter how many years we've been. Even in mid-career, I'm seeing a lot of folks in the DMIN program that I oversee that they're getting themselves in something different at this stage of their ministry that opens up a whole new understanding of their family too. But how do you keep yourself now at this stage when you have a lot of other stresses now about being speaking and teaching and consulting and all of that? How do you hold yourself accountable? What is it that you do?
Well, one of the things is that I wrote about this in the book, in that, the tempered resilience is blacksmithing analogy, and I talk about the anvil is like the relationships, and it has to be a heavy, thick anvil that I talk about as being partners, mentors, and friends. And in the category of mentoring is really the big category for spiritual teachers, therapists, coaches. And I
Mhm.
just have a commitment that long as I am in ministry, I will always be in one of the three or more. That has been a conviction of mine. And so because of that, like my doctor of ministry students are the same thing. There's 3-year cohort. The second year of the cohort is all on their own adaptive capacity building, and they all have to do at least 6 months with me, in some kind of what I call guided mentoring, because people have different traditions, different
Interesting.
backgrounds, and
Mhm.
have to figure that part out. At the moment, that's mostly most intense with me is my own spiritual direction, because um, I am able to identify psychological things better. The transition from being a pastor to a professor, and my spiritual um, and first a pastor to administrator. Actually, I went to seminary, higher education, and then to be a professor again, and a consultant and coach. That was soul sucking for me. It really did disrupt my spiritual practices. I had spiritual practices that were rooted in a congregation. Now it's on a campus with students who pass through. I said the liturgical calendar was the calendar of the rhythm of my life. Now it's the academic calendar, and there
Mhm.
were some parts that I liked better, like I got weekends, but there were other parts that were really hard. When I found myself one day realizing I had missed Ash Wednesday, that I was already in the middle of Lent and I hadn't paid any attention, I said, I have got to have more structure in my life about keeping my spiritual life and my focus upon coming back to God. It is way too tempting for me to become active for God rather than stay intimate with God. And I just have to keep paying attention to that. So,
Well, so that's part of I was thinking about that. I can totally relate to what you're talking about. Absolutely. And in fact, the first year in a seminary setting, I cried on
mm,
every major festival.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but it's an adaptive
yeah,
challenge
yeah.
too, isn't it? Around the continuing formation that we all have. And whether one's in a different parish or a different
Mhm,
kind of ministry context, how to read the signs and use the crucible, use your images to
mhm,
see what's being forged as a
yeah,
result of that. If we believe that God's part of that the whole
yeah.
time. I was thinking about this as you were talking about the quote, and Michael and Damon and a couple other, maybe Marty would know this too. Um, I, I didn't hear this directly from Friedman, but I heard it quoted that every church congregation gets the pastor it deserves, and
Mm.
every pastor gets the congregation it deserves. And I think about that relative to the challenges of
Mhm.
how we work out the
Yeah.
strengths and vulnerabilities that we have as a result of the families that we've been raised in. What do you think about that? Hmm.
Well, I'm a press. So deserve is always a hard word, but that's a hard word for me,
Yeah.
um, because I feel like the congregation that I pastored for 17 years was really beautiful, and God gave me the desire of my heart, And
Mhm.
what's interesting about I don't think I could be with them. And so so it really was the season of time, the right answer to my prayer. Like even my kids who are both deeply religious Christian people
Mm.
have said, I don't think I could go. I don't think I could go back there. So, and that's an interesting part of the journey that feels like grace to me. So,
Mm.
if they deserved me, that feels closer than me saying I deserve them because I was young and they grew me up. I was there from when I was 33 till I was 50, and
Mhm.
and so it's a really that's an interesting. I'm gonna have some thinking about that. I
Well,
do think it's grace, just great, amazing
right,
grace.
yeah, but that there, I guess I interpret that as somehow we've got some growing up to do in relationship to this group of people that um, that is related to that. So I would say, and I was in my first call 19 years too, that these people raised me to be the pastor that I am today.
Yeah,
For good or for ill, but
yeah.
that a piece of that had to do with all the challenges and the gifts that I had going in, and then how to raise them too. So
Yeah, Emily, that's a very nice thought. I have to think about that more. That's there's probably there's very much parts that we needed each other. There were things that I brought to them um, that they would never have embraced before, and I think they would enrich them, and they certainly was stuff they brought to me. So yeah,
yeah,
that's
I mean this whole idea, and the ELCA, we talk about mutual ministry. We've got committees that do that too, and that kind of image is there for good or for ill. The sabotage, the lack of movement, all of those kinds of things. That there's these relationships that we get to take with us that help shape us, that include that I'd say extended family that's not blood related at that point
yeah,
too.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, it's rich. I love
yeah.
that. Thank you.
And we had I think we talked about this at the conference though. Who would you say ordained you in the not within the Presbyterian Church, but what the question that Friedman would often ask in his own coaching is to who in your family system ordained you to serve. What it means, blessing you, seeing the gifts.
That's
Uh,
interesting. Yeah. So okay. So this is actually that's a very dear question for me. My grandmother, my Italian Catholic grandmother, gave me on my ordination day a picture of my grandfather standing behind his bar. He was they had a restaurant, and I was babysat at that restaurant. And I really believe that was the moment that my grandmother said, "Okay, we thought you were going to be the priest in the family, but this is okay." Like it felt to me like this giant blessing to come from my grandmother, who was a very devout Catholic, and I think that I was the the little Italian Catholic boy. And so I think that was the sense of blessing. And I do still remember that picture actually of my grandfather is in my office. It's my most cherished picture. And the interesting part about that is when my grandfather died, so
like,
I often talk about the way in which the legacy of his life is part of the way I think active leadership. There are ways in which I am really profoundly different than him just from hearing stories and even our cultural differences, but there are so much of our core values. I think for my grandmother to be the one to bless me in that way really is the key to that moment.
that's a beautiful
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
beautiful story. Yeah. One of the examples in the tempered resilience is, and you have so many really interesting examples of how you use these images and tell a story about them.
mm,
But I was struck by the miners who temper their picks after a day of work so that they're ready for the next day as an image
yeah,
for the pandemic in some ways. So I just wonder what thoughts you have right now about this time. I mean, it seems like your book was written before the pandemic,
it
mostly. Yeah,
was,
yeah.
yeah.
So timely that this is a crucible of some kind. And
Mhm.
how are we tempering our picks for
Yeah,
what comes next. So,
Yeah. So yeah, that whole notion. So it was the imagery, imagery about a tempered, resilient tool comes from the imagery of Martin Luther King Jr.'s in the I Have a Dream speech about hewing out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. And so the idea of what kind of tool can hew, like a chisel as opposed to a sledgehammer, right? And so that led me on this rabbit trail of lots of thinking about all that stuff and paying attention to it. And even taking a blacksmithing class, I've literally made two things with the blacksmithing class. So but I had a miner after I used illustration come up to me, this is what we do every single day. And the whole point about that is, so then I went and talked to a blacksmith, and the woman who runs the blacksmithing community in Los Angeles, this urban blacksmithing community. And she said, the thing about it you realize is every single time you hit a piece of steel, you're adding stress to the steel. So that's what makes it stronger. It's making it stronger because you're pounding it is making it stressful. So you heat it up and you hold it so that it'll be open to receiving the stress. But if you keep using the tool, every time you use the tool, you're adding more stress to it. So if you just keep hammering, she goes, if you just keep hammering on the same tool over and over and over again, it will eventually become brittle and break, which is the imagery of the failure of heart, really, in one sense, right? So tempering is about removing the stress so that it is still strong but is flexible. And the key to that is that's a slow process. So when we think about, first time I ever saw somebody blacksmithing, they were blacksmithing something that didn't need to be tempered. And so they would finish and they would throw it into the water, like almost like with a flourish. It's like it goes. And what she would tell me is all that does is lock in the stress. So I think about pastors who think, I'm going to run until I drop up until the very last minute. Like literally, I can remember 1 a.m. on Christmas Eve, coming home from the midnight service, having to make my kids finish my kids' toys, and then going to bed at like 3 a.m. and waking up exhausted the next day and calling that vacation. And then after a while, I realized I did that every week. I finished my sermons on Sunday. I would fall into bed for a nap. I would be like all you're doing is you're locking in the stress. And so the key to tempering is you have to slowly, regularly reduce the heat. And I kept thinking that rhythm needs to be figure out how to make that part of our lives. That's what makes us tempered. So that rhythm of regularly, slowly reducing stress. So for me, this is a lot of what like the outdoors do for me and certain spiritual practices do for me. But it became really central to my thinking about what tempering was. It was the way in which that works. And those of you, if you know anything about blacksmithing, it's more complicated than that, but that's the basic.
Yeah, I think, and you heard me say at the conference, it doesn't do much for me because I don't have experience in that way, but I do know about slow cooking and about building for a marathon, because I've run marathons too, is you don't run the full marathon right off the bat. You build the capacities and you do it slowly, and you take time off too. And also that tears in your muscles are actually contribute towards strength, just like a broken bone. Places where there's been breaks are often stronger. So do you have any thoughts then? I am thinking about this, I'll call it the ultra marathon we're on right now around ministry in the middle of a pandemic and Black Lives Matter and all these places where there has been maybe stuff that's gone underground. There's chasms that are showing themselves, that where the vulnerabilities are, that as a result of all of this. So what are your thoughts about that relative to this time?
Yeah, so early on in the pandemic, I read an article that Heifetz and Linsky and others wrote about leadership in a permanent crisis.
I use that in class.
Yeah, isn't that a great article?
Yeah,
because part of what it does is it gave me language for talking about a crisis like the acute stage and the adaptive stage. So we have to take seriously the acute stage, like being in the emergency room, right? And and every single time we have another setback, it feels like we're thrown back in the emergency room. But what happens is very often all we're focused on is, I just want to get out. I just want to get out. I want to put my own clothes on. I want to go home. Right? And what you don't realize is what Heifetz was pointing to was that if you can take the visit to the emergency room as the signal to enter into the adaptive stage, where you can look at the underlying issues. And so for me, this is where COVID has actually been a helpful metaphor. I'll often talk about my 78-year-old dad, who has many of the underlying issues. I mean, the wrong Uber Eats guy shut his door without a mask, and it's bad for my dad, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about the fact I don't only want my dad to survive, I would like him to pay more attention to his health so he could thrive. And that I think this is a moment where many leaders are going to have to ask their questions. How do we move from the acute to the adaptive stage? And I think there's something about being able to invite people from the acute into the adaptive stage that actually has purpose and meaning, energy. Like there's opportunity there,
Yeah.
while still acknowledging that every setback puts us back in the acute stage. So we need to then hunker down, take care of each other. So I think there's a rhythm to it I had this with a coaching client. I was working with a larger church. They were all doing great work talking about this church happens to be the largest church denomination. They said, I think it's our responsibility more and more for us to be willing to take some risks and to experiment and try some things that other churches could learn. I was so happy with them. He said, and then 2 weeks later, I'm on a call and he said, well, I don't think we have to do that stuff anymore because the vaccine is coming. And I was so mad. Like I was like, dude, wait a minute. I think there's lots of opportunity for you to take advantage of this instead of saying, oh, well, we're going to have a vaccine, so we'll just take care of ourselves. And so I do think there's these opportunities that people are going to miss. And there's these opportunities that we could take advantage of to grow and strengthen, creative and adaptive.
If things are slowed down in our thinking and our reactivity, this is part of the quick fix that Friedman talked about too, right? Yeah. Right. There's also, I don't know if you've seen, there's another article by an author by the name of Petra Galleri about the importance in a crisis for us to not only be principled visionaries, but the importance of creating a holding environment.
Nice. No, I do not know that one. Thank you.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please. Yes. I do not know that one.
That to jump too fast to an outcome, or we're going to reconfigure all these departments because this issue is being raised, and we're gonna go after it. The relationship connections and keeping something slow and steady is very important. So yeah, I'll send it to you, and I'll send it to everybody. Actually, yeah.
That's very, very. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so we have really wonderful people here who have some thoughts that would like to be in conversation with you, Tod. So this is what I'm going to ask is if you have something that you would like to bring up in relationship to something that's already been said, or a question that you have for Tod. We've got about 20 minutes before he needs to leave. If you would, in the reactions area in the bottom of your screen, if you would wave your hand, just click that there. Yep, exactly. Thank you, Lori Strang. And I will I'll just mention your name and you're next to talk. We have enough people here that I think it's better to do that than leaving it sort of open. Does that mean Lori Strang? Lori Strang cannot talk, but she
put a question in the chat.
Yep. So yeah, let's just see what that is here. Yeah. So she said, Tod, I don't know if you want to read this or I can read it to you.
Yeah, when you were with us in May, you spoke about the turning in to online worship and how people had just set up their video to record in an empty sanctuary and how that lacked adaptation. What would it look like for the video to be adaptive in your opinion? Yeah, thank you, Lori. It's really great. This is an interesting thought because early on in the pandemic, what everybody was figuring out, how we do everything we did before now virtually, right? And what you had immediately was people getting exhausted. Like my daughter is a youth worker. She said, all of her bosses were saying stuff like, kids love technology. I'll bet you can do everything over Zoom. She said, Zoom is what they use for school. So now the youth group feels like old Sunday school classrooms where you're in classrooms memorizing catechism. Like that isn't it.
Or you're doing worksheets, right? Or you're doing
you're doing worksheets, right? Like that's the same thing. So part of what I would say is, I think early on, and there's a history of innovation about this, like the early stage plays were just a camera in front of a stage play, right? That was the early version. Then they figured out there was a
looks like he's frozen.
Stage play.
There you go.
Hamilton, that was a camera in front of a stage play, actually was more than one camera in front of the stage play, right? So there's a different thing that comes out of it that is called the film, that is different than the play, but they both can be really powerful. And I think that's where we're heading. I think we're going to start heading more and more into thinking about how do we use technology in ways that deepen and highlight and connect instead of replicate what it used to be. And the same thing, by the way, for those of us who teach online, like I think Emily and I both went through the same experience. We were all talking heads. Now we have to figure out how to do an online teacher is different than doing what I did in the classroom on Zoom. That's the worst. Necessity of using technology and using opportunities to think of what is the core value, the core essence that I need to get through the goal, and then how am I going to adapt that.
So the part of this then too is I think about, and I think this was one of the things I was thinking about as you're talking to Todd, is the difference between what is a technical thing and what's an adaptive challenge. An adaptive challenge is something that requires different ways of thinking. It's not just more difficult, like you said earlier. It requires you to, and the pandemic's forcing us to think differently.
Yeah, exactly. It's think about, so one of my favorite things to think about at the moment is the whole notion of community and connection. Because it's clear that there are ways technology can create that. I mean, I get to be with all of you guys. I mean, I've now been with this community twice in the last year in ways that if we were doing analog, I might see you every 3 years because of expense or whatnot. But there's also paying attention to the limitations so that it does what it does. And I think that's really hard. It's hard to think in different categories about those things.
So, Laura, you're saying that Snapchat-ish type stuff and following through with some more personal perspective features. That's what she's thinking about.
Yeah. So, for example, one of the things my daughter figured was really following up as high touch as possible. I mean, there was one season of time, she's in Austin, Texas, and the laws, the openness goes up and down in Texas. Where when she was delivering Chick-fil-A wearing a mask to somebody's porch just so she could tell the kid for 10 minutes when they get off Zoom at lunch, I'll come over and see you, just so they care, right? So the most analog thing in the world, delivering the lunch to the door of one person, matched with we're staying connected through technology in other ways. I think there's going to be lots of those experimenting, and more than anything, what I want to highlight is the experimenting. I think the thing I've learned the most is people who are trying to predict the future. I just learned this from the Silicon Valley folks. Don't predict, prototype. Don't try to predict the future and try to skate to where the puck is going or any of those things. Instead, one step, try and experiment, figure out what we learn. And the next prototypes are small, modest experiments. Prototyping our way, trying new thinking, tell it where does it get us, I think is much more hopeful to me.
I use example, this is not my thought, but my spouse is a conductor, a choral conductor, and they have principles for the choirs that he's in, and one of them is don't be tied to the outcome. So that you stay in the moment, and certainly also that means that the concert or the recital isn't the thing, it's the process of the learning that's the most important thing.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Anyone else? Mark, do I see a hand there? Do I see a hand there, Mark Oxter? No, okay. But there is a hand in your frame. I like it, but it's not the usual. What else?
You're on mute.
Okay, Marty.
I'm off mute now. I was thinking about you were talking about blacksmithing, and one summer I spent the summer working at Inland Steel Company in East Chicago. You don't have to know the name of it there for that reason. And we changed from making steel in 18 hours when I was working there one summer as a laborer to making steel in 75 minutes. It wasn't the same quality steel, but it was made quicker. And it goes along with the same analogy you were talking about with the blacksmithing. you can make steel quicker and it will be less resilient, or you can take 18 hours and cook it and do all the things you do with cooking it, which they did with charge cars, adding things along the line, cooking the recipe, and it produces stronger steel. But people were looking at how do we make money more quickly.
Interesting.
Mhm.
And so I got to work on both sides of the plant because I was the poor college laborer who got to work in both parts because they were making the shift from how do we make more money rather than how do we make better quality steel.
Mm. Interesting. Thank you, Martin.
So, you know, I think that all of us can vouch to the strength that comes with slow and steady. But in a time of heightened anxiety, when all of our reactivity probably, I was thinking about, I've seen people do things that seem to be out of character in situations like heighten a conversation that didn't need to be in, and just wonder how much is the circumstances that are all around, and then what do you do to slow yourself down, and also what do you do as a ministry leader about containing that and seeing it as a flag of some kind and managing it.
Yeah. So partly for me, this is the place where the adaptive thinking really does help. You know, you think about adaptive thinking as it is always requiring a shift in values, habits, behaviors. So it requires learning. So I always say things I learned from being a pastor in a community very close to the Marine base is the Marines used to always say, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So you slowed things down until you can move. And then you didn't slow it down for the sake of being slow. You wanted to, the goal was to move fast, but the way you learn fast, on a battlefield, for example, slow it down. So slow is smooth. For me, smooth is about learning. We go the pace of learning. As we learn something, we turn around and learn another thing. And pretty soon it does speed up. That's the whole, if you look at the whole notion of innovation, like that's why it's this, like it's not this. It has this feel to it. And I think there's something about that if you stay in the learning posture, it does begin to speed up. So it's not just about making something slow. Like, I mean, the academic world is famous for talking about keeping things slow and the same. And we're watching schools go down because they're not willing to adapt and not even willing to adapt, even in light of things like data. There's a lot of new things you can do, accessibility you can do for classes, teaching methods that are different than just talking head. Like we can become resistance. And that's one of the biggest issues, I think, bluntly, in the race issue too. A lot of our brothers and sisters are saying, look, we're going at the pace that makes white people comfortable. And about the fact that enough that's a challenge.
Can you repeat that, Todd? I for whatever reason, you were frozen in the middle of that comment.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
What I was saying is that one learned from having conversations with many of color is that, a lot of times slow becomes a way of not bringing change. It becomes a work of avoidance, right?
Sure.
So we're going to go at the pace that, basically the majority dominant white people in power are comfortable with, not at the pace that's needed to actually bring the changes that we need to bring. And so there's a good place for those of us. That's why I often say that, if you think about a holding environment as being managing heat, rather as a leader, we're the thermostat. So our capacity to continue to learn, grow, tolerate our own anxiety, our own anxiousness, actually, the more we grow, the better, the faster things can change. So, yeah.
I was in a clinical conference last week, and then Tony, I'll invite you. But one of the things that was said over and over is curiosity can be an antidote to anxiety. Yeah. Engaging curiosity in whatever way. So.
Yeah. Howard's hand was up before Tony's, if it's okay if I just
Whose was?
that. Howard's, I think, was. Yeah.
Howard, sorry. Yep, I didn't catch that. No?
No, no problem. No problem. Thank you so much for this conversation. I had a question about sabotage and how do we identify the signs in self-sabotage? And then what are some of the ways that we can spiritually develop a resistance to sabotage?
Do you mean specifically resistance to self-sabotage? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I only have one antidote, which is
Okay.
I have to be willing to be vulnerable with somebody else.
Okay.
Like I just like I will like I just will. I want things to work for me. I want to be comfortable. I want to I literally I mean I literally was the guy who said in a senior administration meeting, I think we're overreacting to COVID. Like I'm the guy who said it because I didn't change my life. I didn't want to change. And so what I needed other people in my life who I could say that to and then look at me kindly and say, do you wonder if do you think you might want to think again? Like, this is why I'm so committed to the idea that we need other mentors, I need coach, I need partners. That's the only, there might be other things, but the only way I know how to sabotage is to vulnerably put myself before someone else. That's the only way I know.
Yeah. Thank you.
And have the kind of people in the community, for me, that are willing to say, Emlyn, you're full of it. Right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Howard, for the question.
And Tony, think?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela and his capacity to reach across divides when he was experiencing within his own coalition tremendous opposition to reaching out to those who were so different from him and who advocated a system of government that was anathema to what he was attempting to do. And so I guess it made me think about the obstacles to acting on the courage of one's convictions, whether they come internally or whether they come externally. And I was thinking of what are the obstacles that can do us in from acting upon some deeply held beliefs. And I use Mandela as one example of someone who was remarkably adept. And maybe it took 27 years of solitary confinement to have that kind of grace, to use your term. Yeah. But that's where my head was going as I was listening to you talk about the capacity to adapt.
Yeah, thank you for that. So interesting you mentioned that, because just yesterday I uploaded on my Kindle again Desmond Tutu's book No Freedom Without Forgiveness, right. Because I found myself thinking we are becoming more and more polarized, and the anxiety, part of the anxiousness in churches is literally being accused of colluding with the enemy when we are supposed to be friends, when we're supposed to be family, when we're like I mean, I know pastors who, when they talk about, you know, loving people on the other side of some divide, a lot of times it's political these days, right? You literally get overwhelming obstacles from your own side, and that is just the most painful place to be in. That's just the most painful place. So I appreciate that. I appreciate those are obviously legendary people who are remarkable leaders.
Other comments or questions for Tod, or conversation starter?
Could you give us the name of that book again by Mandela?
Oh, I just mentioned it was Desmond Tutu's book. No Freedom. Yeah, No Freedom Without Forgiveness.
No freedom. Okay, thanks.
Tony mentioned Mandela, but I was thinking about Desmond Tutu was writing in a similar place, No Freedom Without Forgiveness. Yeah, both as the Justice and Reconciliation Project.
Thank you.
Ruth, yes.
I'm working with a congregation that has to think about not being a congregation as it is now. It's very small. It's running out of people faster than it's running out of money in the sense of people are wearing out. Do you have any recommendations on where to get some guidance in leading these people? Because they're very anxious.
Yeah.
And, you know, the pandemic doesn't help, and the political system has made it worse.
More worse. Yeah. I do think that there's going to need to be, I'm working right now in 2 projects with 2 different denominations where part of what they're trying to name is, one group calls it a legacy congregation, like a congregation that is actually now thinking that its ministry is its legacy. And what it means is, how do we be as healthy as we possibly can? And it's almost hospice. How do we have a good death, a fruitful death? How do we, John 12, be the seed that falls to the earth and dies so will bear much fruit? And how to make that a natural part of our organizational and congregational ministry, the way we way we think about that in terms of the life of a human. Like every now and then, I just like to remind people that not a single one of Paul's churches exists today. And that we have to be reminded that there is a life cycle to organizations and institutions and congregations, but we often don't talk about what a fruitful death will be like.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that for those of us, I think if we get a lot of our folks who've been well trained in hospice and that kind of ministry, thinking systemically about congregations, I think we're going to have some rich conversations and possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? I wonder, we just have a few minutes before Tod needs to, Skip. Neither do those countries and civilizations exist today, right?
Bravo. Good one. Well done. Yeah.
Before Tod has to leave, I'm wondering if you would, I'd like to ask Jill to do a screenshot so we have a picture, unless you do not want to find your face on a Healthy Congregations newsletter. If you would turn on your camera, and I'm asking Jill to take a screenshot of the gathered group tonight. Thank you, Jill. And thank you, Tod, very much for this interesting, thought-provoking time. And also, as is true of most gatherings of these folks, it's time to invest in books after these conversations, right?
Feel free to.
That's right.
Nice to be with you. I look forward to the next time our paths cross again.
Thank you, Tod. Have a good time skiing in whatever natural environments you find yourself in. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Blessings.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Folks, if you would stay on for a few minutes, just want to share with you a couple things and see if you have some